Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the cartoonist of graphic novels like Relish, French Milk, and the recently released Kid Gloves, 9 Months of Careful Chaos. It's Lucy Knisley. Thanks for coming on, Lucy.
Oh, my pleasure.
So I want to talk about Kid Gloves and your work in general here in a minute, but before we started recording, we were talking about cats, and I want to start with talk about your most recent comics work, which is your Instagram comics that largely follow the life and times of your cat, Linny, which are the absolute best. So from a pure comedic standpoint, is Linny your ideal subject for comic making?
I think I really don't have a choice here when it comes to making comics about Linny. She's incredibly vocal. She's an elderly cat, and if you've had an elderly cat, you might know that they tend to get whinier and whinier as the years progress. So she makes herself known to me about 600 times a day, and I'll just be sketching in my sketchbook, and she is like, "Excuse me, please focus on what's really important here, me." So she sort of interjected herself into my comics without my permission at all.
Yeah. I really love the one comic where Linny is repeatedly saying like woe, despair, lament, because I feel like my cat Kubo is really in the woe, despair, lament zone right now. And it was, it's funny how you have relatability in cat comics where they actually speak words, but it is 100% relatable for me.
Yes. And, for human beings that feel much like cats these days.
Oh, of course. I do like how Linny showed up throughout Kid Gloves but has been elevated to a starring role in your Instagram. Like, that's fantastic to me.
Linny was much more central to my comics before I got distracted with the whole becoming a parent and having a child thing.
Sure.
So she sort of made a resurgence. Yeah.
That's great. So I want to, go back to the beginning of when you started doing biocomics, and like the first thing I ever read from you was French Milk. And I've always been curious about the world of biocomics because it seems like, it's like one of those types of stories that not everyone necessarily could tell. How did you get started on biocomics, and like what appealed to telling stories about yourself and your life?
Well, I think that part of it was timing. I came into comics at a time when the internet was really starting to blossom,
mm-hmm.
and everybody and their aunt had a blog. And for me, I started basically doing comics as a alternative to having a blog. I was very shy and introverted. I had I'd been making comics in my sketchbook for years throughout being a teenager. But as soon as I got to art school and I was studying to be a painter, I was really, really socially awkward and unable to connect with my classmates. So I started making comics about my experiences and started publishing them in the school newspaper and online, and got this great wave of response of people saying, "Oh, I had a similar experience. I felt just the same." And it was this light bulb moment for me that I could make something that people identified with and that people connected to as a way to connect to other human beings sort of beyond my own shyness.
Mm-hmm. Was that shyness something that took a little bit to get over once you actually started working on these comics, or was it pretty, because you're used to expressing yourself in that way, was it easy to get over that?
In terms of comics, it was much easier. It was a much more fluid language for me to express myself in writing and art than it was in person. I would say that it took a lot longer to be comfortable at like a party
sure.
than it did to be comfortable publishing my comics.
Mm-hmm. So I'm very fascinated about the whole world of autobiocomics, and so I have a number of questions about that. One of the things I think is really interesting, though, is because, reading your comics and talking about like how, even within the comics that you publish, like Kid Gloves and Relish and Something New and everything like that, you talk about the response you get from people. And I'm really curious about whether or not, when you meet readers, do you feel like, is there like a friendliness there already? Do they feel like they know you already because of your comics?
Yes, definitely. I always feel very happy to connect with readers. It's my favorite part of this, but there's this joy to meeting them on both sides. But I feel like um, readers are often they often feel a little bit awkward knowing so many things about me when I don't know much about them, and they're always like, "Oh, it's so weird. I'm such a weirdo that I know like your cat," and I'm always like, "No, that's great. Let's talk about my cat. I love her. This is awesome." So I think people think that it would be more awkward than it is. I'm always very grateful and honored that people remember things and feel connected to me through my work.
It's a really interesting thing. Like when you first started doing biocomics and like publishing them, it was around when you were graduating from school, right? So like 2006.
Yeah, I was publishing them online before that, but I got my first publishing deal right out of school. Yeah.
So it is kind of interesting because it's you couldn't have planned this, but it is kind of like your career has like matched the rise of like the whole idea of like personal brands and things like that, where
Yeah.
people really feel like it's like if I follow somebody on Twitter, you start to kind of feel like you know them because you know about their pet or you know about this or you know about that, and
Mm.
I feel like that rise has kind of helped to a certain degree because your comics reveal a whole lot about you, and it matches that level that people know about, personal brands and everything like that. Like I said, you couldn't have planned that, but it is kind of interesting how it's kind of run in parallel to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think the internet has really changed the way that we consume other people's lives.
Right.
So it's been handy, but I will also say that autobiographical comics have been around for
Sure.
ever, for as long as comics have, and I'm really gratified to see that people are paying more attention and that really wonderful, diverse points of view are being published these days. Because when I was coming into it, it was sort of like, um, there was Joe Matt and Craig Thompson and a lot of sort of dudes telling their stories, and now the internet has given us this kind of democratic way of sharing our stories. So now people can read stories by anyone, which is
Hmm.
wonderful.
Yeah. One of the things involving technology, like my day job, I work in an online or in an advertising agency and online social media. And one of the things that is often like, I don't know, talked about, I call it the Instagram effect, where basically there's like the idea that if somebody like takes a photo of their lives, it's often quite curated and you don't really know
Mm.
how representative of that person's life it is. Is when you're telling your own story, are you pretty self-conscious about making sure you represent things as like authentically as possible to like avoid that Instagram effect type thing, or is that something you can't really even think of?
Well, I don't know. It's interesting because I think about that a lot in my work and I try to be very authentic. And for me, the work that I'm making is stuff that I wished existed. So
Right.
it's not like me trying to present myself. It's me trying to make a book for my past self.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so damaging, that Instagram effect, I think, especially I'm a new parent, essentially. My son is almost 3, but it still feels very new. And it's very raw. And I was making comics about pregnancy and new parenthood and seeing these things online and in magazines. It doesn't only exist on Instagram. You look at the magazines at the checkout at the grocery store and it's all celebrities like, clutching their very tiny little bumps and being like, baby bliss and,
Right.
oh, I'm in heaven. This is so wonderful. And I was like puking for 6 months and in agony, and pregnancy was really hard for me. And I was looking at this and going, this is not reflective of my experiences at all. Is there something wrong with me? So when I set out to make comics about parenthood, I wanted to show that I was having not the best time so that other people didn't feel so isolated and like there was something wrong with them. And that's basically what I try and do with all my comics. I'm trying to be honest and trying to show what I really think and feel. And that doesn't always work out perfectly because I'm not a perfect person, but
Sure.
hopefully these comics can make someone else feel less alone.
Yeah. I mean, and that's something I've always appreciated about your work is how like you always feel like you provide a very well-rounded view of whatever subject you're addressing. Like for example, these are two diametrically opposite examples in terms of importance, but in Relish you had a section about junk food and the value that there's, you know, there still is, like, if you enjoy food, you enjoy food. If you happen to enjoy McDonald's French fries, you happen to enjoy McDonald's French fries. And then in Kid Gloves, I would say that the section that was most important to me that you included was about how, you know, maybe being a parent isn't for everyone, because my wife and I are not planning on having children. And so, you know, reading a book about the process, you know, having a kid and that entire experience and everything like that, but still having a perspective that, you know, allows for other views and doesn't, you know, isn't pushing a perspective and is honest about how it is for everyone. That was really meaningful to me because, I don't know, it kind of reminded me that, like, I'm not wrong necessarily in doing that. It's what works for me, if that makes sense.
Of course. Yeah. My husband, until recently, you know, until 4 years ago, basically was not interested in having children. And his reasons are totally legitimate, and they're just as legitimate as mine for wanting to have children. So it's something that I was very careful to make clear in the book. I wanted to say, you know, this is a book about, you know, reproductive health, and I'm telling the story from someone who became a parent, but it's great to be interested in reproductive health, even if you're not a parent or not interested in becoming one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It was definitely, I don't know. It kind of, it made me feel good. Like when I was reading the whole book, I loved the whole book, but when I got to that, I was like, okay, yeah, I feel, you know, better about me while reading that, I guess. But in terms of when you're actually, this is one of the things that really fascinates me about biocomics is how it kind of impacts your day-to-day life and your interactions and everything like that. Do you have to remind yourself to kind of stay present in social interactions, or is that something that, I don't know, you just have a background process where you're like, this could be good?
I think that I sort of have a muscle memory that keeps those things in mind.
Yeah.
But I will say that I have sort of two methodologies that are pretty separate in terms of how I make comics. I have my regular 9 to 5 job where I sit at a desk, and often I have a script that I'm working from, and I have layouts and all these kinds of things that I've sort of thought about ahead of time. And then after that's all done, and, you know, I have dinner with my family and do all the things that need to be done around the house, then I get out my sketchbook, and that's when the comics, like about my cat or the funny things that my son does, kind of come around, because those are things that I don't script ahead of time, that I just sort of want to jot down really quickly and have a record of. So that work is it's a very different process than the work that I do during the day. And I think that they both inform each other. But I will say that things like travelogues that I've worked on in the past, I have sort of had to focus on what's happening now while also processing, like, okay, how is this going to be part of the story?
Right, right. When you actually, you know, going back to like your first travelogue, did you go in knowing that you wanted to do a travelogue into that trip, or was it something that just kind of naturally rose from it?
Are you talking about French Mill?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to challenge myself to keep a drawn journal in France, and that was sort of where it ended. I was like, I want to draw and write every day. And sort of in the back of my mind, I realized that this was a little bit of a crossroads for both my mother and me, that I was sort of coming into adulthood and she was turning 50. And so we were both sort of re-examining everything in our lives and doing so through the lens of travel.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't fully conscious of that. I just sort of thought, like, okay, this is going to be an important trip. I've never, you know, been here before. I really want to record what I'm going through and see if I can keep a record of this. And when I came home, I had more than just like a record of what we ate and saw and did. It was really about what was going on in my mind and my relationship with my mom. And that sort of pushed it to become more of a worthwhile story to publish.
Mm-hmm. See, that's that's one of the things I think is really interesting is, like, when I talk to a lot of artists, they talk about how they don't like looking back on their work because of how their art has evolved. You know, and it's like, you know, they look at it and they're just like, oh, I can't believe I was, you know, this was how I was as an artist. But the interesting thing is like I feel like looking back on French Milk for you would be really interesting because you'd be like looking back on not just a different artist, but a different person in some
A
ways.
completely different person. Yeah, it's agonizing.
That's it's really interesting.
The
I
art
don't.
I don't mind. Like the art I can say, oh, I've, grown and developed and, I'm so much better now. And I guess I could also say that as about who I
Yeah.
am as a person. Like I've grown. I'm trying to do better now, but it's really hard to look back and be like, oh, I was such a spoiled brat and I was such a like anxious mess back then. And it's great that it exists. I'm really glad that I did it and recorded that part of who I was back then. But yeah, it's really difficult to look back on that sort of thing.
I will say that the most important part of that, though, is that you actually look back and do think those things. I think a lot of people don't necessarily think those things. I think that's where personal growth comes from.
I hope so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yo, everybody. I want to take a quick second to talk about my friends over at SpinnerRack.com. When I was a kid, I loved spinner racks. They helped me get into comics as I'd spin them and discover comics to love starring the X-Men, Batman, and beyond. And then they disappeared. But now they're back as the team over at Classic Spinner Rack produced new spinner racks for comic fans to purchase that both evoke nostalgia and look amazing in your home. I got mine in the mail and quickly set it up in my office right by where I podcast and had a blast picking some of my favorite comics to go in it. Sure, it's got copies of classic issues like the Avengers #1 and X-Men #4, but it also has personal favorites like Non-Player and Buddy Cops. It both looks great and makes it easy to read some of my favorite books. Want your own spinner rack? You can buy your own at spinnerrack.com, and when you order, use the code OFFPANEL, all in caps, to save 10% when you do. Order yours today, and I guarantee you'll love yours just as much as I do. And now, back to the show. Well, last question before we get into kid gloves. This is related to actually kid gloves to a certain degree. I thought it was really interesting in kid gloves how you would actually mention that there was certain parts of actually like raising Pal that you held back because, it is or may come in a future book. Like it's like foreshadowing another book. How does that impact how you think about what you're doing? Like, do you know that there's like certain parts? I guess it's all just feel based when you're putting it together, isn't it?
Yeah, I really just wanted to tell the story of reproduction,
Right.
not parenthood. I don't know what I'm talking. I've only been doing this for not even 3 years. Like I
Right.
don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to parenting, but I was in it for the pregnancy, so I felt like I could speak with some authority on what I went through and on the things that I was learning. But in terms of parenting, like there's nothing I've experienced that's been so bewildering as it, and I don't feel qualified to write a parenting book. So, I'll make comics about my son here and there, but it's also I don't want to take his story. All of the books that I've made have been my story from my perspective, and my family and friends have been a part of that, but it's really from my perspective. And when I make comics focused on my son, it's taking some of his perspective. So I don't want to do that. And that's something that I want to be clear about. So I made a lot of comics about him when he was a baby because he was a baby and that was my baby. He's not going to remember any of that stuff. And he was basically a meatloaf. So I felt entitled to tell those stories. But as he gets older and older, I'm trying to step back and really respect his ability to tell his own story. So I think about how to include him in my work going forward. And in the future, I'm sure he will be a part of it, but I want to make sure that I respect his right to tell his own story.
Yeah. I was reading an interview with you where you were talking about James Kolchaka.
Yeah.
And about how, American Elf and what kind of impacted like how you were thinking about that. And that makes sense because it's, it's kind of like, I don't know, here's a personal example. Like my family always has these massive Christmases, and like my mom was telling a story about me that I really didn't want her to tell. And she like repeatedly was telling it over and over and over. And I like, finally I was like, I need you to stop telling this story because like, I don't want you to tell the story. And from that point on, she was like really annoyed with me. And it's just interesting because it's like, you have to be conscious of the personhood of the person you're talking about and like the control that they have of their own story.
Right.
And it's, it's awesome to hear that that's something that's an important consideration for you.
Yeah, and the line gets so blurred when you're a parent. Like this person is so dependent on you that there's a lot of, identity blurring of the
Sure.
lines. Like this kid that you raised from infancy, you made them with your body. And I just want to be really aware of that so that I don't cross those lines in the future where I'm like, this is my story to tell because I'm made this all
Right.
happen.
Right.
Like it's just not okay.
So in regards to kid gloves, which was fantastic, I thought it was wonderful. How, I mean, pregnancy or having a baby was always something that was important to you, but how did that stand out as a story you wanted to tell in comic form? Like, I guess, like, what are the origins of kid gloves in terms of the comic itself?
So when I was very young, I was really fascinated with reproductive medicine. I wanted to be an OBGYN or a midwife when I was growing up the whole time. And I became a comic artist. I went a different path, but I still retained that fascination and that interest. And I was amazed with the potential of my body to do that, to go through this weird transformation, this scientific alchemy that created a new person. And I've always been really, really interested in that. And I never got to be an OBGYN or a midwife. So instead, I get to tell stories the way that I am hopefully pretty good at, and in a way that helps share that interest, that passion, and that research with others.
Hmm. And was it important for you to, like, represent all facets of pregnancy? Because, like, we talked about, how you have the section about, not being a parent, but there's all kinds of elements of it, like the history of the medicine of it and things like that. Was it important for you to make sure that you had a diverse and, like, well representative version of what this experience is like?
Yeah, and my book, I tried very
Yeah.
hard, but it barely touched on the whole history and science of reproductive medicine, of course. And there's so many interesting, wonderful other stories. Pregnant Butch is a wonderful, very different perspective on the whole thing. And I think that there'll be more and more of these stories being told as more people go through these weird transformative experiences and tell these stories. But for me, I couldn't tell the story of my pregnancy without putting it in the larger, broader context of reproductive medicine.
Hmm. I think one of the interesting parts about it is like, you had the experience with, like, preeclampsia, and that was something I honestly had never even heard of before this. And I imagine that might be something a lot of people, maybe some people, have never heard of. And
Mhm.
it's interesting. Like, I'm not trying to be dramatic or anything like that, but that's the type of thing that somebody might read, and then when they're actually pregnant, they, like, might put that inkling of a thought in their mind and might make them ask questions they wouldn't have otherwise, which is really fascinating.
I really hope so. I was very deferential to my doctor. I really sort of respected him over Google, that sort of thing. But I almost died, and that sort of deference that we have, it's wonderful to have a doctor that you respect, but you need to be able to advocate for yourself as a patient. And I felt like I was advocating for myself as a patient, and I still almost died. And in the US, we have this incredibly, unacceptably high maternal mortality rate that is so much worse for women of color. And you have to examine why that is. You have to start thinking about what is wrong with the medical system in this country that women who are very healthy and young and doing everything right are still dying.
Hmm.
So I really hope that this book makes people more aware of that and helps people to advocate for themselves.
I think in some ways it's kind of a variation of what we were talking about with, like the magazines when you're at the grocery store and everything like that, where it's like people kind of accept things to be true because that's what they hear, or that's what they see. And it's interesting because even if it, like you said, it's this is not like a replacement for, like, a medical journal or something like that, but I think it could make people ask questions, and I think that's a very healthy place to be.
I hope so. Yeah.
So in terms of, like, one of the things I enjoy the most about your books is like you have this excellent structure where it's like you mix in the personal with the informational. Like in Relish, you had the recipes that would kind of break up like the more personal chapters, and then this one you had like the medical history, and then you had conception, misconceptions, things of that sort. And I think that is you know your all of your work is great, but it is such an excellent secret sauce to your work and how it makes it all flow and how it all ties it all together. What makes that structure important? And like, how did, I don't know, this, you might not even be able to say like how this came together, but how did that structure that kind of seems to be pervasive in your work, how did that first come together?
That first came together in Relish, where I was trying to explore this idea that comics allow us to take in a story through reading it and through this sense experience of seeing what happened. And I wanted to add another sensory layer of these sense memories of the taste of something that I would reference. And I thought a great way to do that was to use recipes to evoke this food. I also find that as somebody who's a very visual learner, the way that I've always learned to make food in the past is by watching my mother perform the actions. And I can't watch food television because they go so fast and they skip lots of parts and it's all very confusing. And reading from a recipe is a little bit dry. You know, there's all these sort of long columns of text and you lose your place. You have to come back to it over and over again. So I wanted to bridge that gap and make something that you could read at your own pace, but you also get to watch the hands perform the tasks. And I think that recipe comics are a wonderful, wonderful way to learn to appreciate or cook food. And I wanted to include that in the book. I felt like it was necessary as this book about food. And I wanted there to be recipes showing how to make the food that's referenced in the chapter. So it began with that. But I will also say that with French Milk, I wanted to combine the story with photographs as a way to sort of say, here's my perspective and here's a more objective perspective of the camera telling the same story. And I really liked kind of bringing that together. And that duality, that sort of dual storytelling nature is something that I try to bring to a lot of my work, where it's like, here's me telling the story. Here it is completely controlled by me. I'm showing you how I remember it looking. I'm telling you how I remember it happening. But also I want to bring in science and history and talk about things that are a little bit more outside of my perspective.
Mm-hmm. I will say that those I really appreciate the sections in Relish, if only because I don't remember which came first, but I read Relish and then also watched Julie and Julia. And they convinced me, or like, I don't remember which one came first, but the first time when I read about the mushrooms and about how you're supposed to have space in between them, I was like, I don't know about this. And then the other one came out and I was like, wait a second, is this a thing? And then I was like, it is a thing. I'm cooking mushrooms wrong. Anyways, well, no, I think the structure is great, and it's a really great way to connect with the story in multiple ways. But I guess like when it comes to those non-personal sections, like how do you decide what to include and what not to include? Because like, you know, for Kid Gloves, as you noted, there's like a sea of information you could have included.
Yes. Well, I wasn't setting out to make a book that was, sex ed 101.
Sure.
Most people, hopefully in their lives, will get some kind of education along reproductive lines. But the book that I wanted to tell was about misinformation and things that even if you find yourself researching and informing yourself, which I did, you can still be totally shocked by information that you didn't know. So what I chose to include in this book is mostly information that I didn't know before I began the process of becoming a parent, and things that really blew my mind. So a lot of it is lesser known facts, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another section in the book that really spoke to me was the miscarriage myths section. And I'm of the age where like that, it becomes a more prominent thing for friends. And it's, I have some friends who have went through that, and just reading through that made me understand, especially because I haven't had kids. I haven't went through that experience, so I don't really know exactly what that entails. So going through or reading that section really opened my eyes, and I feel like I already had empathy, but maybe like a better understanding of what they were going through. And like
Yeah.
that was a really welcome chapter, because I guess like I wouldn't have expected that looking at the cover, so to speak.
hmm hmm Yeah, I when I started thinking about making this book, it was before we began to try to get pregnant, and I was like, "Oh, I think that would be really interesting to just tell a pregnancy story." And I thought it would be this very clear cut, like, we got pregnant and then we had a baby, and oh, first trimester morning sickness kind of thing. And I, as as terrible as my pregnancy was, as bad as the miscarriages were, I'm really grateful that this book is not just this straightforward forward pregnancy story, because we have plenty of those. Everywhere we look, movies, television, books, is people just like, oh, and then we had a baby kind of thing. And it's it's not it's not telling the truth. It's not telling the whole story.
Right. Don't you actually have like covers from some of your favorite baby movies in here? I think, wasn't Look Who's Talking in there?
Yes, big favorite.
uh yeah, no, that definitely, no offense to Look Who's Talking, but it definitely didn't really cover the realistic world of pregnancy or anything like that, or the amount that babies actually talk. Maybe they do talk that much, I just don't know.
I mean, it's essentially what I do with my cat, where I put words in her mouth. So
do you
I have a,
ever do you ever sing to your cat?
oh, all the time. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's one of the things that people don't tell you about getting pets, is that you will come up with songs for your pets that are made up, like lyrics with their name,
Oh yeah.
for like every pop song that's ever existed.
hmm Yep. That's totally essential pet ownership.
I had no idea. When I was a kid, I was like, I like petting dogs. And now I'm like singing a song called Cat Boys to the tune of Bad Boys, the Cops theme song.
That's excellent.
Yo, everybody. I want to take a second to talk about my friends at TKO Studios. TKO Studios is a new comic publisher that launched with what the New York Times calls an impressive slate of talent. They publish books by top creators, including Roxane Gay, Jeff Lemire, Garth Ennis, Gabriel Walta, and many more. TKO also does things differently than other publishers. They binge release their books and offer each title in whatever format you most enjoy reading your comics in, whether that's a 6-issue set in a collector's box, trade paperback, or digital download. I'm a single issues guy, so I went that route and I love the collector's box. Even better, all of TKO's first issues are free to read at tkopresents.com right now. So if you're curious, visit tkopresents.com to give them a try, or follow at TKO Presents across all social platforms. And if you're a store that's interested in stocking TKO's books, email retailers at tkopresents.com to learn more about one of the best retailer deals in the industry. And now, back to the show. So I do want to talk about your art, because I went back and reread, some of your previous work, and then jumping into Kid Gloves. One of the things that struck me, and I may be totally off base, is it kind of feels like in some ways you're almost like simplifying your line as you approach your art. How do you feel like your art has evolved as you've moved along as a cartoonist?
Well, I mean, it's definitely evolved from the journal-y, sketchy stuff that I started out with in French Milk. I'm a very big fan of Tintin when I was growing up, so I think a lot of my Line Claire influences come from that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I don't really know where that comes from. It comes from practice, and it's interesting because my sketchbook work often doesn't look similar to my published graphic novel work.
Mm-hmm.
And I love experimenting with new materials and techniques, so I'm always kind of trying new things. But when I want to tell a story, I want to make it clear, and I want people to be able to follow what's happening. And to, when you're reading a comic, you have to take in the words and the image at the same time. And it's a lot more for your brain to process than just reading straight text. And I wanted to make my imagery very simple and very sort of arresting, so that people could take in the image, take in the words at the same time, and not overexert themselves, I guess.
Right. I actually think that's really important too, because, and I could be totally wrong about this, but it feels to me that your comics very easily could be a lot of people's first comics.
I am a gateway comic
You
for
are a
sure.
gateway comic, but I mean, it's like I could imagine kid gloves being something that like parents or people who are interested in being a parent. It starts being on those lists. It's like books you should read when you're thinking about getting pregnant, or like Relish. Like that's such a fantastic book for somebody who loves food. I mean, like all these different subjects you talk about. It's kind of going back to what we were talking about with the cats earlier, where it's like deep down, it's about relatability and being able to understand what a person is going through and what a person does go through when they go through these processes. And I think that your work is excellent at that. I guess that's part of the reason why I think it could be a lot of people's first comics, is because contextually, I guess in the mass market, there aren't a lot of comics that really touch on these subjects. Like I always say, I wish there were more food comics. Like I know there's a lot of food manga, but like food comics, it's a lot more limited than I would like, because I love
I
food.
know, but I think that's changing. I think there's more and more every year. I keep finding new ones. So I'm very happy to see that food is entering the comic sphere more and more. But I totally agree. As irritating as my books have been to booksellers and librarians to find where to shelve them, like among the graphic novels or among the content, they tend to really enjoy that they have that nebulous quality, because it does bring, someone who's never read a comic into the sort of a Trojan horse thing, and vice versa. Someone who's very into comics but picks up Relish and then gets into food and food writing. So I really am glad that it's kind of bringing people into the fold both ways.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about the Instagram effect and like the personal brands thing and how that's evolved as your careers went along. But I do think another thing that's really interesting about what's evolved since your career took off is like when you were first graduating from school, and like I believe it was like 2006. That was the year after both Scholastic Graphics and First Second started. And,
Yeah.
and so that was like the nascent days of the comic market, where things weren't just superheroes or adult graphic novels. I mean, there was a lot of self-published stuff, and there was some smaller, obviously there was like Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly and publishers like that. But I feel like the rise of Scholastic Graphics, and perhaps even First Second in particular, has really opened the market up to a lot, or the American market up to a lot of stories that weren't being told before.
Yeah. And it's funny that you say the American market, because in the UK and Europe, there have been a much longer history of these kinds of stories being told through bande dessinées and graphic novels. And I really credit Scholastic and Macmillan for bringing those comics to America, to allowing for these voices to be told, these stories to be told.
Mm-hmm. So I did want to ask about for a second. I do love that Callista Brill shows up as an occasional character in your work. That is really
Yeah,
she's very recognizable with her hair.
she is, right? Yeah.
So, working with For a Second, you've worked with them for a long time. What is it about working with For a Second for these books that really like has made them an ideal partner for these books?
Well, they know how to make a beautiful book, which was important to me. And they know how to sell them. They know how to find the market. And they've been really so committed to making such a beautiful collection of books for as long as I've worked with them, which at this point I think is over a decade. I love working with Callista. She's wonderful. And it's been lucky that we've had similar timing in terms of
I was going to
the
point
things.
that out.
Yeah, like she got married and then I got married, and then we had kids pretty close to each other, and we've had a lot to talk about when it comes to the content of my books.
That was very fortuitous timing, like as you note in the book, because you were working on. Were you working on something new when you were having Powell? Was
I
it
was, yeah. I finished something new partway through the pregnancy, and then it came out when I was 9 months pregnant.
perfect time for a book tour
Oh
or
yeah, it was
marketing?
great.
I mean, it was very fortuitous though, because if anybody is going to understand what you're going through, it's an editor who she was she did she just have a kid, or was she
Her
much further along than
kid
you?
is like 3 or 4 months older than mine, so she just had a kid. I think she was on maternity leave when the book came out.
Yeah, that worked out quite nicely because I'm guessing
Yeah,
she had a lot of empathy for what you were going through.
definitely. Yeah, they were very understanding.
I just had Gina Gagliano on the podcast, former first second marketing and publicity person, and now the person who is running the new imprint at Random House Graphic. I did want to talk about you do have a 5-book deal with them, including 2 picture books. So what I I guess like are you still going to work with First Second, or how does that
Yeah.
work?
So the plan is that First Second still is going to publish my adult work.
Okay.
And I realize that my work kind of, crosses some, YA, adult, like what is what, whatever. But the work that I've been doing for First Second, like Relish and Something New and Kid Gloves, I'm going to continue making books like that for those guys. And then with Gina, I'm going to be doing work for middle grade and children.
Nice.
Yeah.
You are a very productive person.
Thank you.
I do like that you're getting into picture books. Like you just released "You Are New," which is your picture book about babies, and I that is objectively that is objectively a different medium. Like I had Vera Brosgol on a little while ago, and we talked about her picture book that she was working on, and it is different. Like what appeals to you about doing that work on top of your comic work?
I was so intimidated to make picture books. I had like published, thousands of pages of comics, and I was still like, I can't make a picture book. I can't do it. I'm too intimidated. They're so good. There's so many good ones out there. Like, why would I even bother putting myself in the ring with when there's like these giants of the industry already in there? And Vera is one of my favorites, of course. We're going to her Chicago event for the little guys tomorrow.
Nice.
So, people making books now like Vera, who are so wonderful, and then people who've made these wonderful classic books in the past that I'm like, why would I ever bother? They're so good already. So I was really intimidated. And then I had a kid, and I was reading a lot of picture books, obviously, and was like, oh, actually, they're not all wonderful. There are plenty of books that that could be improved on, or there's plenty of books missing that I would love to share with my kid. I wanted to share a book about funny babies, and all the baby books that I found for my son when he was a little baby were all kind of like, oh, the precious, wonderful, new, beautiful life of a baby. And I was kind of like, yeah, but he's also really goofy and like, and a meatloaf. I want a book about how they're funny and they can't really do anything, but it changes and then they start doing cool things. And so that was the book that I really wanted to exist in the world. And that was the start of You Are New, this book that I made with Chronicle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love one of the interesting things for me as like a person who, like I said, doesn't have kids is I love animated movies. And every parent has like incredible opinions about animated movies, even if they don't like them because they've seen all of them a million times.
Yeah.
And I think picture books are kind of the same way. It's like once you kind of get into it, from what I understand, again, not a parent, if a kid starts to like something, they will latch onto that with like a fiery passion. Like my friends, my in-law, my brother-in-law and his wife, they both know like every word to the Frozen soundtrack and to the Moana soundtrack because not because they like went out of their way to do it, but because they've heard it so many times and it's like subconsciously like been embedded into their brain. Like they know it front and back. I just think that's such a fascinating part of being a parent is like you're very immersed in media you wouldn't normally engage with necessarily.
Yeah. I've like never seen certain shows that my son likes, and I still know all the characters from them. Yeah, it's weird. And I'm very grateful to my son for kind of getting me back into children's books because I was just sort of like, no, they're all too good.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was like, okay, I have stuff that I want to make for him. And he's been this big inspiration. The books that I'm making with Gina this summer are, totally inspired by him and how cool he is.
That's awesome. Did you feel like you had to kind of I mean, they're different mediums. Did you have to like rethink how you approach stories in a significant way when you started working on picture books?
Yes, definitely. It's so different. It's much more like the writing is very separate, and then it's like illustrating.
Right.
Whereas comics, I feel, is much more sort of like hand in hand. They go along telling the story. And this was much more like, okay, I have to make the writing perfect, and then I have to make the art perfect. And it was much more, I hope I'll get better and less, like less totally, up my own ass about all of this.
It sounds like you're going to have a lot of practice, which is good.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so.
Did you, I actually haven't seen art from You Are New. Did you change your style at all? Or is
Yeah,
it okay, you
super
did?
different. Yeah, yep. I'm not sure if that'll be the case going forward with my other kids' books, but yeah, I really struggled with finding a style for it that fit how I wanted to tell the story, and it came about really organically. Just sort of one day, I was like, I'm going to do it like this, and then it all fell into place. But it's very different from my comics work.
Right, right. And now, a word from our sponsor. Yo, everybody, I'd like to take a minute to talk about our sponsors over at Impact Theory Comics. Impact Theory Comics is a new independent publisher, and they're releasing their first comic, Neon Future. Neon Future is a collaboration with world-famous DJ and producer Steve Aoki, and is written by the Eisner Award-winning writer of Justice, Jim Kruger, with artists Neil Edwards of Fantastic Four fame and Jeremy Rappak delivering the visuals and building the world. Want to first look at the book and Neil and Jeremy's art? Give Impact Theory a follow on Instagram at IT Comics. If you like what you see and you're a fan of science fiction, this might be the comic for you. So head over to your local comic book shop and get Neon Future #1 on your pull list ASAP. And now, back to the show. Well, last question before we get to 5 questions about food. I wanted to ask about where you live, because you're still in Chicago, right?
Yep.
So I have like I live in Anchorage, Alaska, which is
Cool.
not close to the general comic book scene, but from afar, I have like a deep love for the Chicago comic scene, particularly Challengers Comics and Conversation, which is a place
Yeah.
you signed at. Like Patrick Brower is one of my favorite people in comics.
Oh yeah, he's awesome.
And but it seems like Chicago has a very obviously it's a major city, but at the same time it has like a wonderful comic scene, and even like the shows, like the big shows, like C2E2, near as I can tell, is pretty beloved by the creators that go there. I guess this is kind of like a hard thing to really like speak to necessarily, but like, what is living in a place that is like kind of a not just like a comic book metropolis, but just like a great source for so much material, whether it's food or like, you know, experiences and things like that. How does that affect you as a storyteller and as like a person who just, you know, likes to write or tell stories about themselves?
Well, my little like soapbox about artists and cities is is that Chicago is still affordable. That's, you know, probably going to change in the next decade, but Chicago is a place where artists can afford to live and support themselves, and that's not always the case in places that are more coastal. In New York, San Francisco, it's really hard to be an artist and support yourself and focus on your work. So in Chicago, you can pay the rent and be an artist, and it's still doable. And I think that's why we have such a vibrant comic scene here, because people can afford to live here and make comics as a career. And it's been really wonderful. I own a house. I have a nanny that helps me take care of my kid. And all of these things are really essential to being able to live and make work. When I lived in New York, which I did for 3 years as an adult, I had to hustle so hard. I made less work because I was constantly taking on illustration jobs to try and pay the rent, and, you know, doing things to sort of make ends meet. And it really harmed my work for the most part. Mm-hmm. So I think that part of the joy of living someplace is just being able to actually afford to live there. You know, not only just be able to afford to pay rent, but like I get to go out and have a nice meal. We actually went to Alinea last night.
Is that the molecular gastronomy place that you went? Yeah.
Yeah. And this is like, you know, we went a decade ago before. This is like a once in a lifetime kind of meal, and in my case twice. But when I made the New York Times bestseller list with Kid Gloves, I was like, I want to mark this. I want to do something really special. And we went to Lydia, and it was really, really good. Of course, it was an amazing meal. But that's the kind of thing that really gives me inspiration, getting to go and have experiences and, take my kid to the zoo and get to like enjoy the city that I live in. And I think that that's really important for every artist to be able to have a life outside of making art that allows you to get some inspiration.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm working on a feature right now where I'm talking to some, creators from like the newer generations of comic creators, and talking about like, kind of what does success look like in 2019 for creators? Because, once upon a time, the end all be all was like, I'm going to work for Marvel or DC. Like
Right.
that was what the top of the pile looks like. And now it seems to me that it's more often than not, it's almost like building a sustainable career, telling the stories that mean something to you.
Yeah. And not driving yourself either physically or mentally ill.
Right, right. And a huge part of that, like you're speaking to, is finding a place where you can do that and like afford to live. And
Yeah.
that's not an inconsiderable, like that's a huge consideration, because it's like you can't afford to live in like, I don't know, Manhattan, or like, I mean, even for some people, it's like Portland is getting too expensive for a lot of comic creators. And that's, my friends who moved there back when we graduated from college, that would have been like insane, because back then Portland was in a completely different place, but places change, and
Yeah.
it's amazing.
Yeah, and there's so many different ways to find success in the comics world, through self-publishing, through, doing work through Patreon, through doing work through publishers. And it's wonderful that there's so many diverse ways to support yourself through making art these days. But, you need to find a community that fits with what you plan to do.
Right. Yeah. One thing that I'm really curious about is I love Catherine and Stuart Immonen. Like their work is just astonishing to me. And they're doing a comic on Instagram, like a serialized comic called Grass of Parnassus. And I'm really interested to see how things like social media comics, like how, like, I guess the monetization element of that will be really interesting to me, because it's such like it's where you, what is it, you fish where the fish are, and like
Right.
people are on Instagram. It's like, how do you turn that into like a monetary success is like a massive question, right?
Yeah, and it's so tough with those things too. As somebody who has built a major platform on a social network and then seen that social network fall twice. So I did that through LiveJournal, and then I did that through Tumblr, and both those websites sort of just evaporated. Everyone just left.
Right.
And I had to start from scratch again. It's really interesting to see people like build their whole career on Instagram, and it's like, okay, I'm putting comics there too. We all have to fish where the fish are, but we have to know that this is going to change. We're going to have to find somewhere else. And, I think that's happening with a lot of people that did a lot of work on Facebook now. They're having to sort of move on. And it's always going to be the case, I think, with the internet. There's not going to be some permanent home where you're like, okay, I've figured out how I'm going to do this, and here it is. So it's a very adapting career, I think.
Yeah, and I know that there's a lot of concern about Patreon right now,
Yeah.
because of the way that they're changing their model to a certain degree, and their pursuit of profits because of investors.
Yeah, investors, and just the way that business is set up now. And yeah.
I mean, I'm on Patreon for my podcast, and it's interesting because it's like, if even a small, something as simple as like payments being delayed a few days, that's a big consideration for a lot of comic creators.
Yeah.
And that's happened several times recently. I was going to ask one more question about something you mentioned about Alinea, actually, before we jump to food questions. Hilariously, have you ever seen the 100-Foot Journey?
No, what is that?
It's on Netflix. It's a excellent food movie. It's by
Oh, yeah. Okay. What that is. I haven't seen it yet. No.
it's a very charming movie about basically like competing restaurants in a small French town, where like this Indian family moves there and opens up an Indian restaurant, but there's this one member of the family who's basically a cooking virtuoso. And I'm not, this isn't a huge spoiler, but eventually it gets into like molecular gastronomy world. And I have to admit, I'm in Alaska. We don't have a whole lot of that in Alaska. I honestly like at Alinea, like, if I went there, was there a certain amount of you? You're used to that world, but was there a certain amount of you that was just like, I don't know what's happening with this food?
Oh, they explain everything.
Oh, do they?
Oh yeah, yeah. They're very clear and they tell you what everything is. It's actually wonderful. I wish they did it at more restaurants. Um, and it's a prefix, so they just bring things to you and they're like, here it is. You don't have to make a choice or anything. They set it down and they go, okay, here's what we did. Here's the wacky variations that we did, and it's great. It's wonderful. You learn so much, and yeah, the point is being kind of wrong-footed to sort of see something very unexpected. So even if you're very well versed in food, going to some restaurant that does these really interesting things, and they are all over the country, although probably Alaska is pretty scant on those. It's wonderful because you could be a very experienced diner, and you still are surprised by these wonderful new innovations. It's very cool.
Yeah, well, I'll have to visit. So let's close with 5 questions, very specifically about food. One thing in kid gloves that you mentioned was, I mean, the first thing when you were literally rising from a coffin after being ill for months on end is pancakes. That you were excited about eating those. I am kind of curious. I don't think you actually covered this in specific, but did you have any specific cravings during your pregnancy?
I have a bad sweet tooth to begin with, but
Oh,
when I was pregnant, I had like an insane sweet tooth. It was really bad, and I ate a lot of Thin Mints throughout my pregnancy. I really it was a problem. I also was crazy about grapefruit LaCroix,
interesting.
especially towards the end because I had undiagnosed preeclampsia, so I was really thirsty all the time, and it was hot, and it was like I was just melting in this thirsty pregnant pile, and I would go through like a case of LaCroix every couple of days. It was really bad.
Amazing. I have to say one quick comment about Thin Mints is I have a completely irrational, like I like eating Thin Mints versus the other Girl Scout cookies because like my deep love is Samoas, like those are my favorites, but
Yeah.
I can eat 4 Thin Mints for like 2 Samoas, and so in my head I'm like, I'm eating Diet Girl Scout cookies.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. No, I feel the same way. I'm that way about tagalongs.
Oh sure, yeah.
Yeah, just but the health ones are the Thin Mints. They're cleaning my teeth because they're mint.
Perfect, exactly. You have amazing breath as opposed to Samoas, where it's just
Right.
very dicey. Next question. This is a very basic one, but it's always very interesting to me. What is your favorite meal? Like breakfast, lunch, or dinner? Dessert does not count.
Like specific foods, or do I have to choose between breakfast, lunch, and dinner?
Choose between breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Oh, okay, lunch.
Really?
Favorite. Yeah. Um, I I have to cook for my family. Well, no, I don't have to. Me and my partner both cook for the whole family at breakfast and dinner, and it's always kind of like an ordeal. And we have to make sure that our kid is eating, and it's like you're so exhausted by the end of it. You're just like, ugh, whatever. So lunch is the only meal that I really get to like make for myself and eat alone in my office, like quietly. And
So it's like a treat.
it is. It seems like a treat, and it's usually just nothing like pita and vegetables and hummus, but it's it's so enjoyable to eat alone. I always thought when I was like single, I'd be like, oh, I'm so sad having to eat by myself all the time, but like I really miss it now that I have a family. I'm like, oh, eating is so pleasing when you're just like you don't have to worry about chewing with your mouth closed and stuff.
I totally know how you're feeling in regards to that. The funny thing is, like, I love my wife, and I at no point want her to go away. But she has like a class on Tuesdays and Thursdays right now,
Right.
and when she's gone, I'm just like, oh man, I'm just gonna eat whatever I want, do whatever I want. This is amazing. And the cats are like, you got another thing coming, man. We are all over you.
Of course.
So next question. I mean, this has obviously changed since you had your child, but ideally, cooking a meal yourself or eating out.
Oh, eating out. I love cooking, but I really prefer to be cooked for. I think that's always when people are like, "Oh, your mom was a chef. Like, why didn't you get into being a chef?" And I was like, "Because my mom was a chef, and she cooked for me all the time, and it was awesome, and I got really spoiled, and now I continue to want people to cook for me." And yeah, we live in this really nice part of town where there's a lot of restaurants all over the place, and I'm always just like, oh, like, oh, it's right there. And my husband has a class on Tuesday nights usually, and I'll go pick up my son, and he loves eating at restaurants too. And so I'll be like, what do you want to do for dinner? And then he's like, I want to go to a restaurant. And I'm like, oh, well, if you want to go to a restaurant, okay then. And so we go out and have a little mom and son dinner sometimes.
Oh, that's amazing. I love it. Yeah, I love cooking. I find it to be really relaxing, but if I'm being perfectly honest, like the restaurant, if you go out, like typically you're going to have I just enjoy the experience of dining out. Like the whole like feel to it, and like my favorite food meal is breakfast,
Oh
and
yeah.
I just love like sitting at a delicious diner, and like I'm almost done with my coffee, and then somebody magically shows up to refill it, and I'm like,
Oh,
this is the best.
beautiful.
This is the best in life.
I know. I work from home too, so I'm like, I'm out of the house among people. Like, when we go out to eat, and it's really nice.
Hmm. All right. Guilty pleasure food. Do you have one? Or do you
I
even
mean,
believe in
you
guilty
mentioned the
pleasure
Girl
food?
Scout cookies already. Anything sweet, dark chocolate is really a problem for me. Um, I I'm constantly buying these stupid things at the grocery store that my mother would be horrified by. So it's hard for me to say this like publicly, but sometimes I'll buy like one of those microwave mug cake mixes like, and make those if I'm at a certain point of the month, I shall say.
Hmm.
And those are there is just no redeeming quality to that.
Well, it's like the section you had about junk food. It's like sometimes there's just something like I always I think about food a lot, and there's all these meals that are my favorite. But I like there's a certain part of me that deep down knows that my true favorite food will always be Reese's peanut butter cups.
Yeah, it's true. Have you tried the dark chocolate peanut butter cups from Trader Joe's?
I have not.
Don't do it because my favorite food was Reese's peanut butter cups as well. And my brother-in-law works at TJ's, and he brought this. He was like, "Hey, you got to check these out." And I can't like live without a bin of them in my house now. It's really bad. They're so like I think that were so good, and now I can't eat them anymore
Oh
because
no.
compared to these other ones, it's like that's trash.
I don't think I could do that to myself because
No, don't do it.
I'm like the world's foremost Reese's scientist. Like I have a detailed power rankings at all times of which ones are the best one, and like I can open a package and I'll be like, "This is not good," and my wife's like, "What are you talking about?" Like, there's a dust on top of it. It's not
Yeah,
right.
that's old.
Yeah, it's old. Exactly. It's like that's why the Reese's singles are always the worst ones. Is like
I because they're old.
they're dusty.
Yeah, it's gross. There's also this. I had a. Do you know what speculoos is? The
No.
cookie butter. Okay, so it's cookie butter. It's like they take cookies and they make it the consistency of peanut butter. They grind them up with oil,
Oh my
and
God.
it's spreadable cookie, and it's the best thing in the world. It's also called Biscoff. So I went to this little candy shop in my mom's hometown recently, and I had a dark chocolate cookie butter cup.
Oh my God.
And that, like, I'm still thinking I'm going to go back. That's the first stop I'm going to make when I go back to visit my mom. I'm going to go there and, like, buy a whole bunch of those and eat them all and not share them with my child.
I feel like so I've always facetiously suggested that like the not really facetiously suggested like I've been to a lot of places in the world. I love traveling, but deep down like Reese's are my favorite food. Really, the place I want to go more than anything is Harry like the Wizarding World of Harry Potter,
Oh, yeah,
which I know you've been to.
I have. Yeah.
I'm desperate to go there, but I'm pretty sure I'm gonna have to add that the peanut butter cookie place in your mom's hometown to my list because that sounds like I would
It's owned
die.
by Paul Rudd.
Really?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That is.
Paul Rudd owns the tiny candy shop in Rhinebeck, New York.
I was at a restaurant in Belltown in Seattle recently during Emerald City Comic Con, and I was out to dinner with friends, and there was a drink on the menu, and it was called the Wade Wilson. And I was like, so I asked the waiter, I was like, is that Deadpool or is that like the former Dallas Cowboys quarterback? And he's like, you are the first person that's asked that question. And I love that you asked that. It is Deadpool. And it's because apparently it's a gin based drink. Apparently Ryan Reynolds owns the distillery that's right around the corner.
Oh,
And they named it after him because of that.
oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Huh.
Actors apparently just owning random restaurants around the country.
Yeah,
We don't
right.
even
Why
know it.
not?
So last question for you. What recipe from Relish do people most often bring up to you as something that they made and enjoyed?
The mushrooms.
Really?
Yeah, the mushrooms or the carbonara, I hear a lot. Or the cookies.
I was
But the mushrooms first.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I haven't made any of them yet, but as I was rereading it, I was like, I think I'm gonna make these cookies. The problem with me is like, one of my favorite questions to ask people, like just like as a random icebreaker, not really an icebreaker, but just like it's always an interesting question to me is, what food would you make healthy if you could? So it's like instantaneously, it's like kale healthy. It's like a superfood. And my answer, see that's a clever answer. One of my friends said butter, and I was like, that person is way too
Uh,
smart.
yeah, that's really good too.
My answer is cookies. Just blanket cookies because I love cookies. More often than not, people say pizza though.
Yeah, but you gotta like then all dairy and then pizza would be healthy, right?
Yeah. See, you're a loophole person. I like it.
I'm an ingredients person.
Well, Lucy, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure, David. Thanks for having me.
Before we go, I want to give a special shout out to Sean Kirkham, aka Big Clutch, one of Off Panel's patrons, in another edition of Big Clutch's Beast of the Week, where I highlight a creator or comic that blew me away recently. This segment will sometimes feature guests and sometimes not. This week, it's just me, and I'm going to highlight Joe Quinones, the artist of Dial H for Hero. The first issue of this Wonder Comics series came out recently, and while it was good all around, Quinones' art was the best part. His typical work was incredible, as per usual, with some of the best character acting in the business and absolutely brilliant colors, but the best part was something a little bit different. His depiction of the first issue's hero that the main character transforms into, Monster Truck, was hilariously spectacular, with Quinones clearly having a blast resurrecting the 90s, if only for a minute. So shout out to Quinones, this week's winner of Big Clutch's Beast of the Week. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Lucy Knisley. You can find her on Twitter at Lucy Knisley and on her website at lucyknisley.com. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to exclusive written and audio content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Spotify and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel on social media by liking it on Facebook at /sketch, that's SKTCHD, following it on Twitter at SketchComic, or following me at @SlicedFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Anthony Rubin, Keegan Ray, Milton Lawson, Wesley Gift, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Gus, Andrew Scott, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Johan Brander, Paul Reinwan, Connor Farner, Vita Ayala, JDC and Mac Gagnon, Aditya Bedekar, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, Kieran Mark Antonio, WMQ Comics, Akil, Greg Lockhart, Kokachi, Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Aaron McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Evan Blazer, Brian McRae, Ira James Udaskin, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Brenda Batista, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Phil Null, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Max Welshman, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Nicholas Kesslake, Greg Rucka, Adam Heifel, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.